Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to my list of the top 5 worst and best SpongeBob Season 4 episodes. In this video, I'll be discussing my dishonorable and honorable mentions. And if you haven't seen the previous parts of this list, I suggest you do so first. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more videos similar to this in the future. Also, comment down below of what you thought of the episodes in this video, along with what your own lists would be. Commenting and engaging with the channel helps spread it around, so any comments would be really helpful and appreciated. Lastly, links to other videos on this channel, along with the other parts in this series, and the music I used in this video will be in the description below. And with all that said, let's jump right back into the list. Before we can talk about which episodes were my favorite and least favorite of SpongeBob Season 4, we need to talk about the honorable and dishonorable mentions. But instead of picking a certain amount of episodes that are really good and bad for each, how about I just talk about every episode in the season and give it a ranking. Additionally, I will color code the rankings, which will let you know what category of quality I would put these episodes in, while I actually give additional points of why they would land there. Red for good, yellow for okay, and green for bad. If I were to do a normal honorable mentions, you could consider 6 through 9 to be those episodes, and for dishonorable mentions, 28 through 33 would have fit that section. But I decided I wanted to give my opinion on every episode this season and talk about all of it. So that's what I'm gonna do. With all that said, I have 28 episodes to talk about, so let's get into that. This is a really good episode. While not the strongest one out there, it's got a simple concept that just leads to a lot of great jokes. Both the scenes of Mr. Krabs at the hospital and SpongeBob and gang at the dump are very funny and complement each other perfectly. This episode is very simple, however, surprisingly to its detriment, as there's not a lot to return to, as the jokes aren't that funny, and the stuff at the junkyard is kind of repetitive. But for just how funny this episode is compared to its contemporaries, it still lands pretty high. This is a solid episode that has a good concept with some funny jokes, but I don't think the episode is that funny, and they don't go as far with this concept as they could have. Not even on a story level, but mostly on a joke one. But the fun jokes this episode does tell really bring it up a lot. This might be my hottest take I'll have in this video, but this episode is okay. I know some people really love it, but I feel pretty split on the entire thing. On the one hand, this is a decent story that is kind of relatable, in a sense if you've ever been through an experience like this. The song is great, there are some very sweet moments, and this episode can make you really feel bad for SpongeBob at points, along with this episode being kind of funny in places. On the other hand, the story is so simple, so it's not that relatable, and they don't actually do a ton with it. The episode is also so slow and sappy, and really isn't that funny at all. There's only a few jokes that are really even worth remembering. This just feels like a weak drama at points, which is not what I want from a SpongeBob episode. So what happens when there's an equal amount of things I like and don't like? It falls right in the middle, which you're gonna see a lot of in this section. Selling Out is another episode that is completely middle of the road, but it's even worse than Have You Seen the Snail for just being so simple to a boring extent, and yet not being that funny and really dry throughout, and is worse in all these aspects than Have You Seen the Snail. There aren't a lot of jokes in this episode to begin with. I will say, there are aspects of the story I like, and jokes around Mr. Krabs' retirement that are good, but this isn't a very good story. When it's not boring, you have these weird twists that don't make much sense or really mean anything at all. But this episode is more dull than anything, and the good stuff on top of that does bring it up to make it okay. Now this is a bad episode. While obviously not the worst of the season, and is on the higher end of bad compared to some others, this one is just such a dumb watch. The plot of this episode is good, but the execution is extremely botched. The first half of this episode is just excessive laughing, with an added squeaking sound added onto it. The actual main plot of this episode doesn't get enough time to play out though, and all the jokes around it are kind of funny, like the banana peel gag, but as I said, there's just not a ton of time for these jokes, and for us to get more of them. And then the later half is SpongeBob annoyingly crying, which leads to a pretty terrible ending. While there is some good stuff here, this episode doesn't spend enough time on its actual premise, which works and could work a lot better with that extra time, and is just annoying to sit throughout for no real reason. This episode is everything wrong with Season 4 in one package. It's not a bad episode, but it's incredibly close. The plot isn't terrible, but it is a really simple and soap opera-y story, and there really isn't any jokes, and all the ones I can think of aren't very funny. Other than not being funny, there really isn't anything in this episode that is bad at all, so I spared it from that title, but this is just so bland, and as I said, soap opera-y for no good reason in this comedy show, and I get no enjoyment from watching it. This is a really good one that has fun with Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy through this making a movie story that has a lot of clever jokes on the production of films, specifically lower budget ones. I don't have a ton to say. It's not one of the funniest episodes ever, and not all the jokes work, which is why it didn't make the list proper, but it was really close, and it's leagues better than a lot of other episodes this season. This is a decent episode that is better than some of its contemporaries. I like the premise, even if it's not that creative and they don't do a ton with it, even though what they do is a lot of fun. I like an amount of jokes, even if I didn't laugh a ton and didn't find any of them that funny. And I like the twists of the episode involving Patrick becoming smart, even if it's a very minor thing in the episode on whole. With all that said, it's just a pretty alright episode. This is another bad episode, but it's definitely the best episode of the season I would give that label to. There are some decent jokes here, and the initial premise is a solid one, along with this one just being more dull than anything. But that is the problem. An episode like this should not be this boring. But it is. They have no fun with this concept, and the plot goes exactly where you think SpongeBob would take this story, down to every beat. It being really generic and repetitive and just kind of annoying is what pushes it to be a bad episode, when it really has every right to be a good one. It's just a snore, but there are definitely worse things you can be this season. This episode is really good and was super close to making the list proper. I think Shell of a Man is a more interesting episode overall, but this one might be funnier. The plot is simple but really works, and they get so many great jokes out of it. The drill instructor character is great, and it's just so funny to see SpongeBob try to learn from him and all the strange things that happen. This perfectly builds to an hilarious ending sequence. Just a really funny episode overall in a season that could have used more episodes like this. This is another episode that is decent, though this one was very close to just being okay. The concept is alright, there were some jokes I liked, but not a ton of great ones, or just jokes in general, and that's kinda it. A really fun episode that does a lot with its animation and art direction. It has just the right amount of insane imagery balanced with real jokes, and the story is actually a really good one and makes a true point about how people become desensitized to things if they see it too many times, even if it provoked a strong reaction out of them the first time. There's also just so many random funny moments in this episode, from how lame the Dutchman gets and the power within. Well, not the funniest episode out there, and I'd be lying if I said on rewatch this episode engages me as much as it did watching it previously, but I guess that's the point, and it's still a very impressive episode. Whale of a Birthday is terrible. It's just Mr. Krabs being inconsiderate and cheap on his daughter's birthday, and a montage of SpongeBob at the mall. Well, the stuff at the mall is pleasant enough, I guess, even though nothing at all in this episode is particularly funny, and there are some nice moments in places, like the real boys who cry at the end, but the rest of this episode is just Mr. Krabs' cheap jokes at their worst, especially since it's at the expense of his daughter's birthday. Oh yeah, and Squidward is really weird and creepy in this episode. Some of its positive things do make it easier to sit through than others this season, which is why it didn't make the list proper, even though it was very close. I know some people really like this episode, but it's one I just kind of find okay. I'm definitely more positive on this episode, but what barely keeps it out of being in that good tier is that this episode just isn't that funny. I also find the story kind of repetitive, and the ending fights also just kind of repetitive. Well, I like the basic premise enough, and many of the jokes they tell are decent, along with finding out that timeshare twist at the end, which is hilarious, and the best joke of the episode, and all of that is enough to bring the episode up quite a bit in my eyes. It's still not one I'm very fond of. Hey, I actually do like this one. While not an amazing episode, it has a good concept that is elevated by the jokes and the great banter between our main characters. While some jokes don't really land, and the episode can be a little too simple and repetitive for its own good, this one is just funny enough for me to call it a good episode, especially because of that song. While I consider this episode to be bad, it's not too bad because there are some individual things I really like and kind of respect about it. I think some of Plankton and Krabs' moments together are really sweet, even if they are a dirty lie. I like some of the jokes here they do tell. This episode's editing and pacing is really good and leads to some dynamically cool scenes, and the way the episode goes about its twists with that fake out ending is really funny because of how the way the scene is paced. How it cuts to black, holds on that for a little bit, and then we see Plankton. It turns what is a super predictable twist into a really cool scene. The reason this one fails, however, is because it's so melodramatic. This is an episode of SpongeBob. If you thought there was gonna be a big status quo change, you are sorely mistaken. You never believe for a second there's going to be, and this makes the episode mean nothing. Even when you're watching it a first time, but especially if you've seen it before. It's just a really slow episode and takes itself way too seriously for its own good. There are barely any jokes to speak of, and it just leads to a pretty dry episode. And I even have a hard time appreciating the good parts of this episode because of how boring it is and how seriously it takes itself when no change was ever gonna happen and it's all just a dirty lie, and the writing just isn't that good to justify it. If this episode didn't take itself that seriously and was more about comedy, that would be one thing, but the fact that this episode tells such a simple but over-dramatic story that is just set up to going back to the status quo drives me up a tree. I know some people like this one, but it does not leave a good impression with me. This is an episode I think is underrated. Yes, you know from the beginning, Gary isn't giving anyone a disease, and no one is probably gonna hurt him. But what this episode does right is it doesn't take itself that seriously, and is used as a fun parody of mass hysteria. That's really all this episode is, just showing Bikini Bottom growing more and more crazy and out of control. And if you don't find that entertaining, fair enough, but I actually did. Everything else in this episode is kind of there, though. There aren't a ton of jokes other than the ones that are just showing off mass hysteria, and everything else just isn't really that noteworthy. Also, this episode can be kind of repetitive and isn't that interesting once they stop focusing on that mass hysteria aspect, and these reasons are why I only consider it to be a decent episode, but still one I like nonetheless. This one's just okay. I think I would have called this good had this been my first time watching it. But since I've seen it so many times, a lot of the jokes rely on shock around what SpongeBob is doing, and when that is lost, the episode just isn't that funny or memorable. Still, I'm more positive on this one because I think the story fits the show well. I think there are quite a few gags that work, even if I didn't find them that funny, and this one did keep me entertained for those reasons. So I give it a pass, even with its problems. Just a perfectly down the middle episode. The concept is an alright one, even if it's a classic trope. Some of the jokes work, and some of them are just kind of annoying. That's really all this episode is, since the story doesn't take a ton of twists and turns, and the ones it does take are okay, I guess. Another episode I think I'm right down the middle on, but I feel more extremely about this one. I'm so conflicted if I think this premise is genius or just really dumb. Some of the jokes are insanely funny, and others are just kinda gross. Patrick is really funny here because he's just normal Patrick disguised as a lady. But Mr. Krabs and Squidward are kinda creepy and jerks here, and not in a funny way. I think what balances it all out is that I find some parts of this episode entertaining at best, and other parts just kinda weird and repetitive at worst. Well, maybe one day the good or bad elements will outshine the other. That day is not today, and it's an okay episode as it stands. One of the worst episodes of the season, and very close to making the list. The story to this episode is so dumb. It's just SpongeBob and Patrick being nervous that SpongeBob turned Squidward into ice cream, which he didn't. We know this because the episode shows us, and the rest of this episode is just the two of them being annoying and stupid while trying to figure out what to do, and then it randomly turns into a Wizard of Oz parody for who knows what reason. This episode is terrible. It has no story, no actual stakes, cause Squidward is fine, barely anything happens in it, and what does happen is just sheer stupidity. What kept it off the list is that this one did get a chuckle here and there out of me, which I can't say for Squidward, thanks to at least one scene, you know which one it is, but this is still garbage. From one of the worst episodes of the season to one of the better episodes. This is one of Patrick's starring roles this season. The story for this episode works because Patrick isn't a jerk after he gets his license, and is actually nice to SpongeBob. Sure, Patrick might be a little overbearing and a teeny bit inconsiderate to SpongeBob's feelings, but he is good-hearted here. Still, you understand why SpongeBob feels jealous, because he has worked so hard to get his license just for Patrick to get his instead. This is a good conflict that really keeps the episode engaging and leads to many good jokes. And there's a very sweet moment at the end after the conflict is finished that wraps everything up perfectly. This episode isn't that funny though, and can be kind of repetitive in places because this story just isn't that complex, but this is still a solid episode nonetheless. And here is one of, if not Patrick's worst appearance of the season. This episode is just showing Patrick becoming an awful jerk who tries to abuse authority he thinks he has due to him being heir to the crown. Well, the crown is corrupting him. There's nothing interesting about this episode, so it's just Patrick being a jerk, and that's it. There are some good jokes, however, and an interesting scene here and there. I do like the scene, at least at points, where he talks to the weird version of himself in the mirror, and these things do bring it up quite a bit, so it's not that bad, but still one of the season's worst. Another episode I consider to be okay. Wow, what a shocker. Look, the setup is good, and there are some funny jokes, but there aren't a ton of them. Oh yeah, shocker, and this episode is really repetitive and not that interesting. And the twist is very predictable and lame. Nothing too bad here, but nothing very good here either. This is New Leaf done right. It never tries to trick you into thinking Mr. Krabs and Plankton are gonna become friends. It just puts them in a scenario where they have to work together, and we get many great gags and moments out of it. The story itself is a little dumb, and we don't really learn anything about what's going on with this shake place, and why it caused harm on all these people, and Mr. Krabs and Plankton don't get enough cool stuff to do together, as this episode takes a little too long to get going, and the ending twist eats up time as well, but what they do get out of this concept is really good, and it makes this episode an enjoyable watch. Another solid episode. Nothing too remarkable here, but it's just a good story that leads to a few different scenes that are interesting and have good jokes in them, and it all leads to a solid conclusion. It's not the funniest episode or the most well written, which is why I don't really like it that much, but I do like it. Mediocre. That's all I can describe this episode as. While the song is great, the story is really lackluster. It's also very slow, and there aren't a ton of jokes either. While the stuff with the security guard is kind of funny, and the ending message is good, even if it's executed in a lackluster way, this is still a super subpar episode. I don't think it's bad though, because, well, I don't even know why. Maybe it's because there were things I liked about it, and it was more boring than anything. Whatever the reason is, this one just didn't bother me in the way an episode I would consider bad did, which is why it barely scrapes by being called mediocre instead of being called a bad episode because of the stuff it does right. But it's just so underwhelming, especially for a SpongeBob episode that was overhyped at the time. And we end our honorable mentions with our last okay episode from an okay season. Figures. Look, the concept is a strange but creative one. Some of the jokes are definitely funny, but this episode just doesn't get too much of a response out of me one way or the other. I wasn't really engaged, but I wasn't bored either. I wasn't really laughing, but the episode wasn't unfunny, I guess. The gum is disgusting, but doesn't bring down the episode for me, and the animation on it is really good, even though I wouldn't exactly call that a highlight. So yeah, I just don't really care about anything in this episode, and there's nothing to really make me love it or hate it. It's perfectly fine. Some might really enjoy it and others may not, but with me, it just kinda falls right in the middle, and I think it's okay. But with all that said, we still have 2 more episodes to talk about. Thank you for watching through this longer video of honorable mentions, and tune in for the next part where I'll finish this list by talking about what my least favorite and favorite episodes of Season 4 are, which should be out later today. So I'll see you there.